The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn. Sorry, not the Lunch and Learn, I should say. Welcome to the free webinar today on engagement. It's really interesting, isn't it, that the surveys show us clearly that 70% of people actually indicate that they're disengaged at work. That's 70%. Obviously, that means only 30% feel that they're engaged. So it's a really big issue, isn't it? And a lot of us are grappling with that. And what I find very interesting is we've got over 100 people who've registered for this webinar today. It's incredible, over 100 people. So obviously there's a lot of interest out there on how we might engage people. Now, I just want to say a few words about it before I launch into some strategies to do that. And these strategies are based on well-founded principles. And they come out of my book, Bringing the Human Being Back to Work, that's just been released last week. Look, one of the interesting things about this is that I think there's a lot of commentary about how we engage people, but there's not a lot of commentary about the fact that the employee themselves needs to be engaged. I mean, it's their decision, isn't it? A person has to make that decision to want to be engaged. And so you can try all the strategies in the world, but at the end of the day, if the employee doesn't want to be engaged, then that's problematic. In other words, nothing's going to work. So I think, the onus of responsibility in many cases is back on the person to be engaged at work. But I just think it's phenomenal that 70% of people aren't enjoying what they're doing. That's incredible and very, very troubling. Anyway, let's launch in. We've only got 30 minutes together, and welcome wherever you are around the world to this presentation. You'll get a copy of the slides. You'll get a copy of the recording at the end of this. So I've got your email address, so I'll send that through to you. Perhaps not this afternoon, but certainly over the weekend. So just relax and enjoy. And also, if you've got any questions you want to ask me, you'll notice over on the right-hand side there's a little drop-down box with questions on it. So what you can do is just simply type your questions in there, and I'll try and deal with them as we go, albeit we've only got a short amount of time together. But if I can't respond to that, you might want to send me an email, and you can see that in front of you on the screen. All right, so look, I think the first comment I'd make is this, that there's a lot of commentary in the world at the moment around artificial intelligence and how it's taking a lot of people's jobs. And I mean, we are, within our rights to be concerned about that, because it's going to change the whole landscape of work. But what's interesting about that is that we as human beings over the last 100 years since the birth of scientific management have actually become more and more robotic. We've got KPIs, we're told to leave our problems at home, we're told to toughen up at work. There's all of these kinds of indicators that suggest that we need to just follow systems and processes at work and not be human. And so it's quite ironic, isn't it, now that we're very worried about the fact that we're worried about robots taking our jobs. So what we've got to do is to reinvent humanness. What does it mean to be human? What competitive advantage do we have over machines that allow us to insulate ourselves somewhat from the work that we do? So that's the challenge, and I address that in my book and talk extensively about this whole notion of us needing to have more and more conversations with people and just to be more human in that workplace, which is critically important. Now, what you're seeing on your screen in a moment just takes a bit of time to come up. It'll come up very shortly. There we go. These are the 12 powerful ways to engage or disengage people at work. When I say disengage, I mean if you're not doing them, it's likely that it will disengage people. So I'm going to go through each of those very briefly with you over the next 20 odd minutes. And you might say, well, where do these come from? Well, they've come from reputable research. And they've come from a space where people have demonstrated that they actually do work. Now, the point I wanted to make, and I made earlier, is that even if you did all these 12 things, you may not get an engaged workforce. In other words, ultimately it's the person's decision isn't it, about whether they become engaged. But what we're doing by doing these things is we're bumping up our chances of creating an environment of engagement, which may, may give the person the opportunity to decide to become engaged. Now, they're not necessarily in order of importance. I'm just going to run through them as they are and just take one at a time, and I'll come back at the end and just recap on these 12. So the first one is you need to explain, if you're a manager, or your managers do at least, you need to explain to people what your expectations are. By explaining to people what expectations are, you make people feel safe. In other words, they know where the line in the sand is drawn. The problem with that, of course, is it's much more complex than we first thought. You need to be able to address all 7 of these questions. The most fundamental question is, what are your expectations as a leader? Are you clear about what you expect of people at work? I mean, obviously, if you're not, you can't really put expectations down because you don't know yourself. So that's the first key question. Now, let's assume that you are clear about what you expect of people. The next big question is, have I communicated these expectations to my team? Now, you might say, well, I've done it once, I've done it twice. You've got to do it over and over again. You've got to do it in different contexts. You've got to do it consistently and persistently, one-on-one and team and so forth. So have you genuinely communicated those expectations to your team members? Now, obviously, if you haven't, then they're not going to know what those expectations are they? Then the next big hurdle is, do your team actually understand those expectations? Do they actually understand what they mean? We assume, of course, they do just because we've communicated, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the case. And then do they actually accept those expectations? Do they think that the hurdles are too high? Do they accept the idea that that expectation is fair and reasonable for the work that they do? Obviously, we again assume that that might well be the case. Then the big question in number 5 is, are people actually committed to meeting those expectations? We assume again that just because we've explained it and they understand it and they accept it, that they're committed. Not necessarily the case. The very best question that you can ask people is, can I get your commitment to meet this deadline or achieve this? Actually getting people to nod, grunt, or do something, or say yes even, that is pretty good, because once they've done that, they have made a commitment, and that's important. We need to get people's commitment. Do they know how they're performing? Have we given them feedback? Do they know whether they're meeting this crossbar or whatever? 7, have we supported them? Are there organisational barriers in the way? Now, these 7 questions are critically important, and you can see it's a lot more complex than just explaining to people what your expectations are. But clearly, one of those key things is to explain expectations, and if you do that, you're off to a pretty good start, I suggest. The next thing is that people need the right materials and equipment to do their job. Now, what the research shows is it's quite interesting, because if you and this is where a lot of organisations make big mistakes. If you give people superior materials and equipment, it doesn't necessarily lead to higher levels of engagement. That's a fact. But if you don't give people the right equipment and materials, it will lead to disengagement. That's a fact. So in other words, there's a threshold where people have an expectation around whether they have the right resources to do the job. But we don't need to overcommit to that, because if we overcommit to that, it's really kind of wasting time and energy and money, of course. So we don't need to give people superior materials and equipment, but we need to give them at least adequate materials and equipment. So that's pretty important, and that's what the research tells us. We also need to give people an opportunity to exercise their natural strengths in their current role. So I ask you this question: are people given the opportunity to exercise their natural strengths? Obviously, if they don't feel comfortable doing the work they're doing, well, clearly the obligation is for them to move on to a job that they do. But wherever possible, if we can actually harness what it is that people do well, they will be happier and perhaps more engaged. There's a high correlation between what people enjoy and their strengths. So the key thing for you is to try to have a conversation with people about what they enjoy doing and consider how you may be able to give them more of that if possible. It's not always possible, of course, but it's certainly worth a try. Now, people will argue and complain a lot that they don't receive enough recognition at work, and I'm not convinced that that's always the case, because sometimes you can recognise people but they don't recognise that you're recognising them, if you know what I mean. So, but the important thing is, do you recognise people when they do good work? And the best way to recognise someone at work is simply to say thank you. And I just don't think there's enough of this. I work across 21 industries, and frankly, I don't see enough of this. I don't see the common courtesy of leaders actually saying to people, thank you. Thank you for staying back to finish that assignment. Thank you for meeting that deadline under pressure. Thank you for dealing with that irate customer. Thank you for keeping your cool under those difficult circumstances in the meeting. Just saying thank you is recognition, and we don't need to give people a medal or something. We can just simply say thank you. It goes a long way. But of course, formal recognition and rewards is nice. It doesn't do much for me personally, but I know there are a lot of people that do enjoy recognition, in a formal sense, and I think it's probably a good thing that you might like to consider how you might do that in your workplace. So do you have a recognition system in place in your workplace, and are you saying thank you enough for the work that people do in your organisation? Becomes critically important. Now, the next key point is, do your managers have encouraging conversations with your employees? Now, you might be bulletproof and 10 foot tall, but the reality is a lot of your people, we all as human beings are quite insecure. And of course we hide it very well, but we're all insecure. We all need some sense of encouragement. And the reality is a lot of managers, they think about this from 2 points of view. One is they think, well, it'll take too long for me to encourage people. They should be motivated themselves, so that's their justification. Well, the other issue is, if I encourage them too much, they'll drop their bundle. Well, there's no evidence to show that, actually. And I think that it's worthwhile considering whether you should be having encouraging conversations with your people more so. The fact is, if you give someone a challenging assignment and, you've given them something that's reasonably challenging to do, they're probably in the back of their mind concerned about whether they've got this, the skills or capabilities to do it. They probably are thinking like that, as you and I do sometimes when we take on a challenging task. So what would be a nice idea is for you to sit down and let them know that you've got complete confidence in their ability to do the job. And I know you might think, well, if I'm giving that job to someone, then surely they'd be aware that I have that faith in them to do the job effectively. True, but have you said it? Do they know that for sure? Go the extra mile, have the conversation. It only takes 2 minutes, makes a big difference in terms of getting people to realise that you have complete faith in their capacity to do the job. So that is a small thing. It doesn't take much, doesn't take long to do, but it can make a big, big, big difference. And these are all practical things that can be done day to day, moment by moment, project by project. Have any of you got any questions at this stage you'd like to ask me? Be bold, go to the question box and type in a question. By the way, the only person that gets to see the question is me, and of course I'll address it with everyone, but just keep that in mind that not everyone gets to see the question that you raise. All right, so while you're thinking about that, let's move on. Now, another bit of research shows that people who are encouraged to develop themselves as people can be a strategy of engagement. So are you taking a sufficient interest in the people that work for you, or do your managers take a sufficient interest in the people that work for them to feel that they are encouraging them to develop themselves? And it doesn't necessarily mean sending people off to courses. That's not necessarily what I'm talking about. But it's giving people a sense of encouragement, perhaps even mentoring might be a way of putting it, but giving people a sense of encouragement and urging them to develop themselves. And you're not doing it because it's in your interests, you're doing it because it's in their interests. And if you do something that might be in their interests, guess what? They'll start doing things, or most will at least, that are in your interests, which of course is showing a high level of engagement and so forth, and commitment to the job that needs to be done. So, this means that you've got to know your people. It means you've got to know their strengths. You've got to know their opportunities for growth. You've got to be able to work closely with them as such. We've just got a question here, or a comment. I'll just bring it up. Kerry asks, do you agree careful consideration of recognition is critical to avoid your recognition feeling like more like punishment? Yeah, look, I'm not quite sure what you're getting at there, Kerry, but I'd say this to you, that I've often adopted the view that you praise, you criticise in private, but the old adage, you criticise in private, praise in public. I'm not convinced about that. I actually think that some people are quite embarrassed about being recognised in public. Why don't you just do it in private, just to say that? I just think the whole point of the exercise is to recognise people. Whether you do it in private and public is not as important as whether you do it. I think that's the critically important thing. Robin asks, how do you encourage our people in remote areas? Well, if you telecommute with them, you can do it that way. On a telephone, works perfectly well. It's personal, it's person to person, and that is important, and I think you should do that. So I think just pick up the phone and talk to them and let them know that you recognise the good work that they're doing. Because hopefully you've got your finger on the pulse and you're aware of what they're doing, so you can do that way. I think that's the best way around that, Robin. All right, let's keep moving. Thanks for the questions. That's fantastic. Now, the other thing that's important in all this is, I think, we've got to genuinely, and the key word here is genuinely, are we genuinely interested in the opinions of others, or are we just paying lip service to it? The opinions of your people count, not necessarily to you, but to them. Now, sometimes someone might have said something, and the last 6 things that have come out of their mouth are absolute rubbish. Okay, we've all been there. Doesn't mean number 7's going to be rubbish. And I think what we've actually got to do is ask people. Now, the best way to do this, if you've got new people in your team or your area, why don't you ask them? Why don't you say to them, look, I'm interested in your opinion. What are we doing well, and what are we not doing well? Now, the interesting thing is they'll have a better perspective on that than perhaps even you or anyone else. Why? Because they're looking at things through fresh eyes. So engage your new people in a conversation about their opinion about the workplace that they're in. That's a great way to engage them in the very early stages in their employment. They're still probably wondering, do I fit into this team? And if you actually genuinely take the time to ask for their opinion, irrespective of what they say, you are setting a very good example and to them that they are important. And who knows, they might give you a really interesting perspective that you hadn't thought about. So talk to people, ask their opinions. If you're having trouble with an issue and you know someone's very good at that sort of thing, go up to them. Don't be humble. Just say, what do you think? I've got this thing I'm grappling with. I really need another perspective. What do you think? They mightn't have a good answer, but certainly they'll appreciate you asking, no doubt. Now, one of the things that's important for you is to create a line of sight between what people do day to day and the big picture. Now, don't be deluded into thinking that people actually understand the relevance of the work that they do. The reality is what people often aren't sure. They've got their head buried up against a tree and they can't recognise that they're in a forest. So how can you create a line of sight? Could it be customer feedback? Could it be you observing them on the job? Could you explain the importance of what they're doing and if they don't do it correctly, that there's problems that are likely to arise? So there's all sorts of possibilities there for you to do that, and I think that that becomes quite important to do that. How do we engage the ones who have given up and don't care, says Robin. Well, it depends on what the industry is, Robin, but I personally think that, if it's a profession or an area of work that people do that they've obviously made a conscious decision to do, and they've gone away and done some study and all the rest of it, why don't you just ask them? Why don't you just sit down with them and say, look, I'm just curious to know, why did you actually join up? Or why did you actually decide to do this as a career in the first place? Now, what you're going to do by doing that is you may not get a really great answer at that point, but I can guarantee one thing for sure, they're going to think about it, and they might just reconnect with the whole reason that they actually started out in the first place. Perhaps they've lost their way, and perhaps it might be a good idea as a leader to actually ask them that question, and that can be a very, very powerful way of getting them to engage in the process. So that could work really well for you. Okay, ask them why they decided to do whatever it was in the first place. Now, I did allude to this earlier, but are you asking your people for their commitment to get a job done? So on a challenging job, don't just assume they're going to be committed. Why don't you ask for it? That's what you want, isn't it? Don't you want people to commit to doing the task? Well, why not ask? And it's quite a respectful thing to do. I mean, for example, I'm going to say to you right now, are you committed to getting this job done? Or should I say, could I get your commitment to get this job done? That's not an aggressive thing to say. It's quite a reasonable thing to say. You want their commitment. Don't assume you're going to get it. Ask for it. And of course, if you get a nod and a grunt or a yes, then they're giving you commitment. And I'll tell you one thing, they're more likely to get the job done because they've committed and they've overtly committed. And secondly, if they haven't done it, you're in a stronger position then to ask them what went wrong, because you can also say that you made a commitment. And of course, if they can't commit, then you have a whole different conversation around why not. And sometimes people aren't committed, but they don't want to tell you that. But by asking them that question, you open up a conversation about why they can't commit to that. So ask them, can I get your commitment to get this done on time? Because it's really important. I don't think there's anything unreasonable about asking that. Now, I think it's very interesting that lately we've heard a bit of commentary around the next big epidemic is going to be loneliness. And I think it's very true that the workplace is a community, the only community that some people have. Have you thought about that? We no longer know who our neighbours are. We don't know who the person is across the road in the corner store, if indeed there even is a corner store. So we don't know any of that sort of stuff, whereas years ago we did. So really, the only form of community is often in the workplace. And it's worth pondering that, because you can't force people to be friends at work. But what you can do is you can encourage and promote positive social interaction at work. So you can do that. And you might find that that's an engagement strategy in its own right. If they've got their friends working there, or they're working with a decent group of people or whatever, that is one of the 12 engagement strategies. So what can you do to encourage and promote positive social interaction at work? That could be very, very useful. Have you talked to people about their personal progress or lack of it? This is, of course, feedback. We do know that feedback actually is an engagement strategy. A lot of people shirk the issue of giving feedback. It takes time, might open Pandora's box, let sleeping dogs lie, all the cliches. How about we just sit down and let people know? Now, of course, if they're exceeding your expectations, great. Then it's going to be a very positive conversation, but it still should happen. And if they're not, you might want to talk to them about that too. Human beings, interesting enough, need to know where the line in the sand is. That's why we have rules, regulations, and legislation and all sorts of frameworks in our life, because we human beings actually have to know where the boundaries are. Doesn't necessarily mean we always adhere to them, but we at least need to know where they are. And by giving feedback to people, you're making people feel more secure, provided, of course, you're doing it in the right way, and doing it in a dignified, respectful way. You're likely to get some good results out of that. So give people more feedback. Here's a little task. This afternoon, go out and find 3 positive things that are going right and give people some feedback. And you might say, well, I don't think I can find 3 things. Well, I would say you're not looking hard enough. And I think that'd be the truth of it. Do you provide people with the opportunity to grow and develop in their job? Do you sponsor their learning? Do you give them the opportunity? Do you give them ways and means of them to develop themselves is a critically important thing. I think you'd be aware that that's important. People want to progress. People want to make sure that they can keep their job. And a lot of that comes from learning and development. So guys, that's the 12 things. And we've only got a short time together, but I don't expect that you're going to go out of here and do all 12. But at least you've now got a checklist and you can start to work on some of those things. The beauty of this is that some of those things are not hard to do. They can be done in a moment and they can make a big difference, and the research shows that clearly. So give it a shot. I think you'll get some great results. Now, just before we finish up, a couple of quick things. My book's just out. I'm very proud of my 8th book, Bringing the Human Being Back to Work, the 10 Performance and Development Conversations Leaders Must Have. If you would like a copy of that book, I've got a few here in the office, send me an email and I'll send you out a copy. It's a hardback copy. It has 10 conversations in there, and I think you'll find that a very useful adjunct to some of the things we've talked about today. And of course, the 12 things we've talked about today are actually in the book as well. And the other point I'd like to make just before we wrap up is that I've got a Lunch and Learn series coming up, and in fact starting next Friday. It's not too late to register. We've had some fantastic feedback about these Lunch and Learn series, and you've got there on the left-hand side the 6 units that we're covering, and a lot of those concepts are pretty much what we cover today. They're an hour-long session done fortnightly, and people receive a copy of the recording and the slides, and we find it's a very cost-effective way. $295 per person, and you're in. And all I need to do is to send you an invoice and to basically send them a registration letter, and they can just click into the webinar. So if you're interested in that, you've got a team of people, or you'd like to do that, send me an email. I'll send you more detail. Thank you, folks. That's it for me. Thank you. It's certainly been a very popular free webinar. You can go to my website if you would like to tune into any other free webinars. I have one a month, and you're always welcome to join free of charge. Just giving up your half an hour is all you need to do. So thanks, folks. That's it from me, and have a fantastic weekend. And thank you for joining, and I hope that I'll be able to give you some tips and hints on how to engage or disengage, if you're not doing it, the team that you have or the people that you lead. Thank you and goodbye, and all the very best. Bye for now.